Okay, welcome everybody to the CD Foundation's online meetups. Thank you so much for attending. I am Tracy Reagan, the host of the CD Foundation online meetups. We've been doing them for a couple of years now. And the purpose is to have conversation. So even though this feels like a webinar, if we can act like we're all in the same room, and just raise your hand or just blurt out questions as you need to. I feel that that's the easiest way to go about this. It's makes it a little more friendly. And that is the point of these calls, is to just have discussion. Today, let me hang on, give you guys a few minutes here. Got a few more people I need to add here. All right, so today we're going to talk about what it's like to do application testing in a Kubernetes environment. We have had these discussions before because when you start to decouple components, the application has a different meaning. Today we're going to have Abdallah Abedraba, I hope I got that right, from TestKube, and they have been thinking about this problem for some time. So on that note, I am going to pass it over to Abdallah, who is going to take us through this journey about what it means to test in a Kubernetes environment.
Cool. Thank you so much, Tracy. I appreciate that intro. And by the way, you did pronounce my name pretty well.
Good,
Abdallah,
thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Abdallah. I work as a product manager at TestKube. And a little bit about my background. I've been doing developer relations and software engineer and a product manager in the past. So I kind of wanted to move quite a lot in the professional spectrum, but I always stayed close to the developer tooling companies. I'm actually going to share my full screen here because this is where my passion is relying at the moment. It's just creating tools for developers and putting as much empathy as possible on them. You can actually find me everywhere in my Slack there, in Twitter, GitHub, which I actually just use as a social media. So as Tracy said, we're going to be talking today about Kubernetes applications. About how to test or Kubernetes applications, because it's really a cumbersome topic for which I in the past have suffered part of it because usually the components are not easy to test. But also testing hasn't been in mind, from the perspective of the application developer in the Kubernetes ecosystem. And so usually everyone does it differently. The systems become pretty complex. And usually the result is that people either stop testing or don't test enough, or even worse, ignoring the test and fixing them, because it's just going to require so much time that it's just business is always pushing for stuff to move forward quickly. And so hopefully what I want to, excuse me, apologies. What I want to talk today is a little bit about how we can think of this new testing approach. And even though I'm going to be mentioning TestKube at the end, I really think that these sort of thought processes can be applied even without using any sort of tool, but just keeping them in mind would be pretty important. So in order to start this discussion, I wanted just to mention how testing is being done at the moment. And if you're talking about testing, you're sort of already talking about running everything in the CI/CD pipeline. And so what usually is happening in these CI/CD pipelines or continuous integration, continuous deployment, is that you're running your unit tests, you're probably building the container, you're publishing the container somewhere. Hopefully you're able to figure out how to update the deployment configuration in your Kubernetes cluster, either using Helm or Customize and what have you. But once you've deployed the application to the cluster, usually in the past, before this whole new GitOps sort of methodology of doing stuff, we were still thinking about how can I reconciliate the state of my cluster. meaning what happens if the application was already deployed, or what happens if someone deletes the application after the pipeline has been run. So how can I reconciliate or reinstate the actual state of the cluster? And I really hate the fact that we've been for a long time just talking about CI/CD as one single thing, because really we didn't have the tooling of the systems that allowed us to think of them as separate components. What happened eventually with the GitOps, again, methodology and toolings with stuff like Argo CD and Flux, is that we've been able to decouple the continuous integration part from the continuous delivery part. And so it's been pretty well defined what does what, who does what, or actually what does what if we're talking about tools. And one of the things that we ended up seeing this stuff as, or like the concepts that we've been thinking of them, is that CI is actually in charge of pushing whatever changes somewhere. It's usually a Git repository or source control in this case, but CD would then make all the work of pulling those sort of events, and then with a little engine running inside of your cluster, it's able to see the state of the cluster and then reconciliate that whole state. And so that problem that we were talking about earlier of what happens if my application is deleted, because these CD systems are acting in a pull mechanism, they can always see what's going on and then pull the changes or even the existing configuration and apply them into the cluster. So this is a pretty good mental model usually to think about them, where everything was like a single monolith, broken down, and we're thinking about push and pull. But the problem is, or actually, let's shift gears a little bit here. When do we want, when and where do we want to run our test whenever we're building applications in Kubernetes? And that's a relatively interesting question. Usually the first simple answer is, you want to run the test on application build, because that's what we are accustomed at. Usually these are the unit tests that we've been talking about, and they're pretty quick. So it doesn't really matter where you're running them as long as they're happening in a quick iteration way. But then the more interesting ones, I would say, is the application deployment. Once I've deployed the application, how can I test that the whole components, now that we're working in this distributed system, is actually being tested correctly? These are usually the integration or end-to-end tests. Maybe you want to run some compute-intensive tests to study, through load balancing testing, load testing and tools out there that can help you achieve it, if your application is actually scaling. And one that interests me is, can I actually run tests once the cluster is reconciliated? Applying changes to a cluster doesn't happen instantaneously, and it requires effort to figure out who should know about when the cluster has been reconciliated, and then running those tests once all of the components are actually ready. Because you might have deployed a single component that was working pretty fine, but then that single component broke another part of the cluster. And until the cluster is not, fully ready, it wouldn't make sense to run the tests. And so because of testing, the CI has still actually coupled to the continuous delivery part. Just what I've mentioned at the moment, right? It's like, I want to run my integration tests. Now I need to expose whichever component that I deployed in my Kubernetes cluster to be able to be accessed from the CI, and then run those tests against them. And so one of the things that I think the GitOps or Flow has achieved is that we have reduced the number of connectivity, or network connectivity in this case, of different systems into the cluster. But if you want to do testing, you still need to enable that connectivity. You need to expose that application to be tested from your CI pipeline. And what's more is that the CI still needs to know the state of the cluster if you want to run a test, right? It's not enough that you have a continuous delivery system that is reconciliating the cluster all the time. If you want to run this test, you want to wait for that system to trigger an event, and then from the CI, you're running the test. And so the whole point of like push and pull has been, faded out a little bit. And usually, if you're not very careful, you might be, sometimes testing the old version of the application, or even you're testing before actually the cluster has been fully reconciled. And to throw more fuel into the fire, there are some things that a lot of in a lot of workflow I've seen pretty common is the fact of rerunning tests. Sometimes the test fails, and I want to rerun it and see what's going on. But the problem is that if my test is relying on this CI pipeline, do I need to retrigger the entire pipeline to run those tests? Is that a simple thing? Is it going to take like a minute or 20 or even an hour to be able to run a single test, failing test? One of the more interesting problems, I would say, is the fact of being able to save the test artifacts. The artifacts are just results that your tests have generated. And so usually the test would generate logs, but there are tools out there like Cypress. So Cypress is a tool for front-end testing. What it does is through JavaScript code, you can actually spin up a browser, do some interaction with the browser, and then Cypress would actually generate some videos and screenshots for you to be able to look at what happened in case, for example, the test failed. And so you want to save that for to be able to look at it in the future. And what people have been doing is connecting their CI systems into a bucket like an S3 bucket or whatever, and then uploading those artifacts once the tests are run, which just makes everything even more slower. And whose responsibility it is to actually add a new test into the cluster? I'm a QA developer, or I'm a tester, or I'm an engineer, and I want to add a new test. A sort of test. Can I add it without actually asking my operations people and DevOps folks to configure the CI/CD systems for to be able to achieve that? It's not really trivial. And if we're working in sort of this agile or quick methodologies, always you wanna enable teams to be able to deploy their tests as often as they can and whenever they want as well. And so one of the components that you also want to be thinking about is you want to reuse the testing tools that are out there. You want to reuse really good stuff like K6 for load testing, Cypress, as we mentioned before, for end-to-end front-end testing, Postman for APIs and so on, to be able to do those testing. And you shouldn't reinvent the wheel in that case. But the problem with all these existing toolings is that they're not meant to be running Kubernetes. These are not systems that if you want to run those tests in Kubernetes, probably you need to figure out how to containerize the tool, but also how to give the tool access to your application in the cluster, and it becomes non-trivial in case you want to run those stuff. And so, yes, testing Kubernetes applications is hard. If it moves like a complex system and it swims like a complex system and it quacks like a complex system, then it's probably a complex system. This is one of the things that we've been thinking about solving, and the solution for us came in a way that we needed to do tests in a cloud-native way, the cloud-native testing. And that includes, being able to scale our tests as much as possible, i.e. our applications are already scalable with the whole Kubernetes stuff. Can we actually scale the tests that we're running, and can they scale at the pace of our applications? You want to make it flexible. You want to make it anyone able to add the test whenever they want. If you want to have a good testing habit in your company, you really want to make sure that the flexibility is there to add new tests or even to fix the existing ones, and so on. And you want to take advantages of the whole Kubernetes automation. It's like we automate everything, but we still haven't been able, to sort of run tests, for example, whenever my cluster is reconciled. These stuff need to be taken advantage of in a simple form. And so this is actually what we worked at TestKube, trying to build and talking to a lot of people, is the fact that we wanted to do testing in a Kubernetes native way. And so TestKube basically is an open source project. It's a CNCF member. And since recently, actually, and I'm glad to say this, it's also a continuous delivery foundation member as well. And the whole goal of TestKube is running and orchestrating tests inside your Kubernetes clusters instead of doing it from a different system. And so, talk is cheap. I'm going to show you a quick demo here of what this looks like. So I'm just going to go to TestKube here. This is the dashboard that you get when you install TestKube in your cluster. So when you install TestKube in your cluster using Helm or whatever, what you get is a dashboard, an API server, an operator, and a database where you can save the logs. And so what you would get is sort of like this dashboard that you're seeing here, where I can see like all of my tests. And then you can, just open the test. This is a specific test that I have in the cluster and all of the times that it's been run. The interesting part of this test is that Kubernetes resource, a custom resource in this case. And so, it is really powerful to be able to do it this Kubernetes native way, because then I can extend tests in any way that I want. For example, I could add a label to a test or an annotation to be run from a specific node that is, different from the node where my application is running, or for example, if I want to calculate latency and so on. But it also allows to take advantage of all these GitOps systems to be able to reconcile not only the state of my application, but also the state of the tests in the cluster. And so once you, for example, run a test with Kubernetes, with TestKube, you'll be able to see that there are some logs generated. And the interesting part here is that these logs are actually saved inside the cluster, and all these metrics that you're seeing is actually saved inside of the Kubernetes cluster. So you can always have access to your own data and see what's going on with the state of the cluster. Usually this is also very helpful for SREs, reliability engineers and stuff, where or even QA teams that want to see how is testing happening and who is failing what test usually. And so one of the interesting parts as well is because TestKube is actually taking those tests and running them inside the cluster. There are interesting things that you can actually trigger, for example, those tests from a specific Kubernetes event. So for example, if a specific deployment with the label, JMeter was modified, for example, then you can trigger an action of TestKube like, hey, run this test, and so on. So this is a little demo of what TestKube can offer you. Feel free to check it out yourself. But the idea is that TestKube actually reuses every testing tool out there, and it's not creating or reinventing the wheel here. There is a vast ecosystem of testing tools out there, and so everything that we've done was just basically package those testing tools and enable anyone to be able to add them to your Kubernetes cluster pretty easily. We just containerize them eventually, but you can actually bring your own. And so TestKube basically does the heavy lifting of running those tests in Kubernetes. As I said before, you don't need to containerize these testing tools that we've mentioned. We already containerize them for you and actually maintain them. But you can also bring your own testing tools. Eventually, everything in Kubernetes is a container, right? The interesting part is that because TestKube runs the tests inside the Kubernetes cluster, you don't need to expose your application to the outer world, outside of your company's VPN. So your CI/CD system, your CI system. I've made the mistake that I actually started with, that I complained about in the beginning, which is mentioning CI/CD together. You don't need to give access to your CI systems to test your applications. Everything happens inside the cluster, and so you can have this totally air-gapped environment that is also able to test itself. So and then TestKube saves the artifacts for you. These are saved in an entire, like in a MinIO database, which is an object database that you install with TestKube in your cluster, and so everything remains in your own infrastructure. One of the cool things is that you've seen me running that test a couple of times. Yeah, TestKube can scale your test, and you can run them in parallel, which could be a huge time saver for a lot of use cases. Again, you don't need to write like complex scripts in your CI pipeline to be able to do all of this sort of stuff. And then, which in turn just makes the entire CI/CD pipeline much more simpler in that case. So what folks do before using TestKube is actually, this is on the left side, you can see a CI system where you're building and deploying and then running a test and then a second test and a third test. Now with TestKube, everything is being run inside of like the Kubernetes cluster, and so from your the CI pipeline just visually just looks smaller because more components have been offloaded into TestKube in this case. So the cool thing with TestKube is it offers the different mechanisms to run those tests. You can run them on schedule. It's just a cron job in Kubernetes. You can run them manually through the CLI or the dashboard that I just showed you. So in case you want to rerun a specific test, you can just click it there, or you could also run it from the TestKube API. So for example, if you have systems that want to interact programmatically with your cluster to test stuff, and if one of the things that I like the most is obviously being able to run tests on annotated labels, Kubernetes objects. So for example, if a pod has been recreated, then just run the test. Let's make sure that everything is working fine. And then the interesting part, which I will be talking more about, is reacting to cluster events or even other events that are out there. But one of the also components of TestKube is that it not only is able to detect when to run your test, but it also can send some events like webhooks, which then, for example, can send an event to Slack to notify if the test was run correctly. The problem with webhooks is that they're really hard to get right. It's not trivial because either the payload needs to be changed or templated, which is even worse. And you are just building basically a custom event reporting for yourself. And so every system that interacts then with TestKube would need to understand those sort of like events that are being generated. And there is repetition of code everywhere because, again, every system needs to implement a way to understand the events that you're sending them. And it just makes things complicated. So this wasn't like a very nice solution that we were proud of, but our users still wanted a way to be able to interact after a test happened. But recently, actually, the Continuous Delivery Foundation started a project called the Continuous Delivery Events. And I'm interested about this project because the idea is that with CD events, you're standardizing all of these events that are being generated by your continuous delivery systems. And so you can interact with different components in an interoperable way because, again, this is standard, but you know also what to expect. And so one of the things that we've done at TestKube, this is the CD events website, is actually recently contribute to the events that are standardized by the CD events. So you have here, for example, the existing events that were created a while ago, for example, for source code control. So if my Git repository gets updated, then I want an event being triggered to react to it in some way. And TestKube just actually collaborated by adding the testing events here. So the thing that we want to do is, sort of standardize the way that we communicate what sort of test has been run. And so if you see them, this is actually still in, maybe it's not published, or actually it is. We can see that there are 3 sort of events when a test is run or a test suite has been run. And so there are some standard predicates, which is a test has been queued, started, or even finished, and something has been published. And then you can actually go and see what is the payload that you're expecting from this test. And so, for example, there is an outcome that says the test has passed and failed or canceled. Hopefully, with the CD Foundation, we can build tools that are more interoperable. TestKube and Argo CD and any tool that is working in the continuous delivery space, they can talk to each other pretty easily without needing to reinvent the wheel every time that we're trying to achieve this sort of efforts. So this is all that I wanted to talk to you about. TestKube, again, is an open source project, so you can go ahead and check it in GitHub. We have a vibrant community in Discord where we're trying to talk as much as possible with anyone who comes there. So please hop along and yeah, follow us on Twitter. This is all I wanted to share. Thank you so much. And I see already Dave with your hand.
Oh, yes, great. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm interested in that CD events. One of the questions I had was about integration with test case management systems like TestRail or X-Ray. Do you see that CD events would be potentially playing, a key role there for the test results, for instance? We'd like to have our test results, let's say, posted to the test case management system that we've been using for quite some time, which is TestRail, for instance. So it would be nice if that were a possibility in TestKube.
So at the moment, as I showed, that's a pretty good question, by the way. I really like it. As I showed, like the sort of 3 events that that the CD events is supporting at the moment, and these are the ones that we just thought of to contribute initially. As you can see here is the test run and test suite run and test output. But then these, the idea at the moment is that more and more sort of tools start supporting these sort of events, not from the point of emitting them like TestKube is doing at the moment, but also from the point of like receiving them and interacting with them. So at the moment, I don't think, or actually it might be possible in the test output event, you can actually see what sort of event was published and the content of that event in this case. And then hopefully these test case management systems are able to, with a little modification, operate on that information, then it would be possible. But I haven't done it myself, of course, so I wouldn't be able to tell you if it actually works. But in theory,
okay, no, yeah, that looks good. Thank you. I'll check that out.
Thanks. Or worst case scenario, it could also be an addition to the CD events. It's a standard that's been still work in progress, and so many tools can still take leverage and expand those events that are being generated.
And I just want to point out that TestKube took on the task of starting the conversation and starting to build out this vocabulary around CD events for testing. We're hoping that we have more testing solutions that can contribute to this. So if you have a particular vendor, I would say make sure that they're aware of CD events, because Dave, exactly what you asked, the whole point is to have sort of a broker that can broadcast so that everybody can pull the information as needed. And TestKube has started that conversation. And from the CD perspective, we're super appreciative for them to start that conversation, but we need more testing tools to be part of it.
Absolutely, yes.
I have a question for you. You said you have a database in each cluster. Is there do you have APIs that could access that data for other tools without CD events to access them?
Yeah, that's actually one of the ways that you would implement what Dave is actually asking. Is like once you receive the event, one of the elements of this event is that there is a URI where the artifact actually is been deployed at. So you can see here, it's actually, this is an internal cluster. And hopefully if you get to this URI or URI, you'll be able to access those artifacts. Having said that, TestKube also offers an API to interact with. And so you're able to access, as you said, the artifacts that it's been stored in the storage of your cluster, of course.
And I asked that because of another open source project, that's the Ortelius project. We gather data on these objects. So we could potentially, through CD events or directly through your API, start reporting on the data for each of the components in an application. And that is my other question. How does TestKube handle right now? Can you, so are you making the assumption that in each cluster you have TestKube running? So it's testing all of the namespaces within that cluster.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So potentially you could have multiple namespaces with different services running in them. And you would be doing a test across all those services.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the coolest part of like not needing to expose any of these sort of applications in any namespace to the outer world just for the sake of being tested. You know, a dashboard or front-end application is usually exposed out there, so you can run a test from wherever you want. But usually an API that is internal, you know, it's always just better to test it from inside the cluster and not from the outside. And that's where, you know, the tooling lagged so far.
And for right now, for most of for customers who are using this, in terms of its implementation, are they triggering these tests then through the pipeline?
You can trigger it from a CI pipeline if you want, but usually there are some people that are, you know, I feel like it depends on the use case and the sort of how evolved testing is in your company. There's a lot of people that are running these after their CD systems like Flux and Argo CD have finished. So once the CD system applies and reconciliates the cluster, it generates an event which TestKube then listens to and then is able to run those tests. The idea is that you want to make running those tests as flexible as possible and not just from a CI perspective. You want to do it using an API or you know, the CLI or the dashboard to run them manually and so on and so forth.
Right, or scheduled, as you pointed out.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's one of the most interesting one. In fact, I think most of these tests that we have here in the demo cluster, which actually you can just access, it's demo.testkube.io and you can play with it. Most of these tests are just like cron jobs that are being triggered every once in a while to test it. So you can eventually under the hood, answering again your question, Tracy, what we are doing is just creating a Kubernetes job that then runs the test, and then we manage the life cycle of that job and obviously save the output of that job. So because it's a job, you can just, you know, do it as a cron job or initiate a million of these jobs. If your Kubernetes cluster is able to handle them, then that works fine.
Fabulous.
Thanks. Really good questions. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions from the attendees here? Don't be
Yes,
afraid, just blurt it out.
Okay, well, this is Dave again. I just I wanted to note, I think the chat is disabled, or at least it's showing as disabled for me in case anybody wants to.
It may be
add a question.
disabled. You're right. I think in these webinars, they disable the chat,
Right.
but you can post it in Q&A.
Oh, okay. So my second question is, I very briefly played around with this last week. I think I saw something about there's a pre-test capability, like before the test, before a test is run, there's a pre-test. Is there a post-test, or would there be a post-test?
It's in the works at the moment. Yes, definitely. Just to give more context to everyone, before running your test, you usually want to do some sort of operations, either pulling some data or fixtures that you want to add to your test. And so we have this concept of pre-test, which is basically an init container that pulls all the data and does whatever operation that you want before running your test. And one of the capabilities that we're actually adding right now is being able to run whatever you want after the test has been run. Either it, so for example, one of the common cases that everyone is finding is that with TestKube, you can actually bring whatever testing tool. If we don't support it officially, you can just bring a container image and TestKube will run it for you. The problem with these container images is that, you know, every tool has a different way, has a different place in the file system where they save those events. And so, sorry, the logs or artifacts that are being generated. And so what this PostScripts can help do is actually just, for example, move folders around so TestKube can access them, or just do any sort of operation that you want to do after running the test. But yes, Franklin, TLDR is it's incoming in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me just point out that if you want to have a deeper conversation with the TestKube contributors, Kubeshop is the company who has contributed TestKube, and their Discord channel is listed there. So Kubeshop at Discord is a place to find them. Or go to TestKube, the website, is it testkube.dev?
I believe it's testkube.io.
Testkube.io, and you should be able to find that. And of course, every open source project is always looking for contributors. I know that for absolute fact. So if testing is your thing, please reach out and let them know that you would like to become a contributor. Contributors, have many levels. It's not just code contribution. It's testing, it's documentation, it's project management, it's outreach, it's doing these kinds of webinars and CDF meetups. So there's lots of ways to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And even opening issues is already like a huge thing. That makes us know that people are finding some problems with the tool and helps us fix them.
Abdallah, thank you so much. For those of you, he is starting his vacation right now. So as soon as we end this, he, I think, is probably done for the day and will be enjoying some vacation time. So thank you so much for, being part of the CD Foundation's CDF online meetups. We sure appreciate it, and the content was great. So thank you all for attending. And we usually try to have these once about every 2 to 3 months. Summer will be quiet. We'll probably have our next meeting in September. So we will see you all at the end of summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.